Afternoon to everyone, and very warm greetings here from Vienna, from the Energy Community Secretariat. This is the fourth Methane Monday this year, but actually running for the fourth year. So most of participants are well informed how it's going on and what is the structure. Nevertheless, it's very open. We want to discuss many topics this year, and as you can see, as I said, 3 took the place this year. Today we have the fourth one, and the next one is really planned for the 14th of July, maybe at the start of the annual leave season. Let's put it that way. So here and there, we try to skip in the Secretariat pure regulatory framework explanation and what is in this regulation, what is there, what is not. But want it or not, topic of Methane Mondays is always actually related to methane regulation, being from different aspects. So here I just put the reminder on one slide, and you will have slides afterwards, what is actually in the scope of methane regulation. But I believe that many of you around this online table are very familiar with it. So today the focus will be actually from the point of view of service provider, and even in more details, let's say, point of view from above. So what from satellites can be seen, and how those data can actually serve the implementation of EU methane regulation. With us is Mr. Pete Hampton, Business Director for EU at GHGSat Europe. And with that, I would just give the floor to Pete.
Thank you very much. And if you'd be kind enough to allow me to share my screen, I will continue with the presentation. Thank you.
Yes, it's coming, still not in presentation mode, but yeah, and now it's here.
Is that in presentation mode? Can you see it in?
Not exactly in presentation mode, in speakers mode.
How about that?
Yeah, now all is fine. Please take the floor.
Perfect, thank you. And good afternoon, everybody. It's a real privilege to be given the opportunity to speak at Methane Monday for June. As introduced, I'm Pete Hampton. I'm the Business Director for Government for the EU here at GHGSat. The purpose of today's session is to take you a little bit through the impact of the EU legislation for us as a commercial operator, and how we work with industry and government. And that's my background, is working with government on ensuring that as legislation is implemented, it's to the benefit both of citizens, but also for industry. So I'm going to spend about the next 40-45 minutes just taking you through an overview, a high-level overview as we see it. And then if there's an opportunity for questions at the end, I'd be very happy to answer as many of those as I can, time permitting. So just a quick view on the agenda. So I'm just going to do a top-level overview from our perspective on the methane challenges as we're seeing them live through our constellation of satellites, how we work with government and industry across Europe. I'd like to do a little bit of a deeper dive onto the methane regulations themselves, or methane regulation itself. Some of this you may already know, and forgive me if you do, I don't know the audience here, so I'm just coming from a base level of knowledge to understand the impacts of this methane regulation, both on EU nation-state governments, but also industries operating within the EU, and then what we can do to help, what we would call data-driven decarbonisation. So ensuring that both parties, both industry and government, have access to real data to allow you to make meaningful decisions. So if that's okay with everybody, I'll kick off. So we all are aware of the rise in emissions and global temperatures. I don't think this is going to come as a surprise to anybody on this call. But if we break out the emissions specifically for methane, they are on a very precipitous upward trajectory from a low point when the early measurements were taken in the mid-1800s through to the modern day. And Europe is definitely one of the highest emitting regions on the planet, not as high as others, but higher than others. So as part of the global output of methane, it is a significant proportion of global methane emissions. So what are we seeing in our coverage? So as an organization, we're monitoring millions of facilities. We're monitoring millions of square kilometers of unique sites. So that could be anything from oil and gas facilities. It can be mines. It can be landfill operations, and a whole variety of other individual locations as well. And we're up just over now about just over 110 countries that we've monitored so far. So on all continents and in most regions within those continents, we are detecting methane emissions of varying quantities across the world. So to drill down to that into a little bit more in the numbers and the breakdown of that, of what we're actually seeing, just last year in 2024, we detected over 500 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent methane across the world. And for us, that was a 40% increase on the previous year of the emissions that we are detecting. And of those, you will see in the proportions of those, 67% of that is coming from the energy sector. That's not going to be any surprise to anybody, but what it is reinforcing the understanding both from industry and from government that there are challenges, and working collaboratively together, industry and government can find solutions to reduce those emissions for everybody's benefit. There are some other significant sources of methane. Landfill is the obvious one there, and nearly a third of the emissions that we detected are coming from landfill sites. And there are some from other lesser emission sources, such as things like wastewater sites and agriculture that we're detecting. But I'll come on to talk about those in a little bit more detail. And lastly, I just wanted to finish off just with a sort of a high-level graphical overview of where we're seeing these emissions. So there are what we would term as super emitters. Predominantly, they're coming from Central Asia and Russia. Again, I don't think that's going to be a surprise to anybody on this call. But what we are also seeing is a proliferation of sort of medium-sized emissions in pretty much every territory, industrialized territory around the world. That includes, obviously, in our case, within Europe. So it's a challenge, and everybody is stepping up to try and address this challenge for a whole variety of reasons, be they climate, be they commercial, a whole variety of reasons. Everybody is focused on trying to reduce methane emissions from wherever they're emanating from. So that brings us down to regulation. So from a regulatory perspective, we're seeing a trend globally on both voluntary and involuntary regulation to try and monitor and report methane emissions from wherever they might be coming from. So I'm not going to go through these line by line, and this is also by no means a comprehensive list. This is just some examples. But certainly in Europe, methane regulation, which was introduced last year, is one of the regulations that's being used globally to help understand the impact of methane emissions and how, as a collective government and industry, we can come together to try and reduce those emissions from wherever they are coming from. These run alongside the voluntary standards, so things like the carbon markets and industry protocols and global frameworks that are running alongside more formalized regulations that are being issued by nation states or by pan-nation organizations such as the EU Commission. So I'll talk a little bit more detail about the EU methane regulation that was launched in July last year. This is an adaptation and an increase on a previous regulation that was launched in 2019. I tried my best to summarize this in 4 short paragraphs. It's over 100 pages long, this regulation, so I had my work cut out, but hopefully you'll forgive the eye charts. But fundamentally, the summary of the regulation is that it establishes rules for reducing methane emissions in the energy sector, and that's an important thing to note. At the moment, it's only covering the energy sector, and it's specifically targeting oil, gas, and coal, operating both within the European Union and then as we move forward for imported fossil fuels as well. The regulation is mandating measurement, monitoring, reporting, and verification of those methane emissions alongside mitigation measures such as LDAR and restrictions on venting and flaring, which I know, speaking to my colleagues in our oil and gas team, the oil and gas industry is very focused on reducing, because of obviously there are a number of benefits to the oil and gas industry from reducing the need for venting and flaring. It also, as a regulation, outlines the responsibilities on those operators, oil and gas operators, mine operators, and importers, and it establishes or attempts to establish a framework for what are called competent authorities. And I'll talk a little bit more about who those competent authorities are. It will come a little bit more clear if you're not aware. They are effectively the folk within government that are responsible for gathering the information from industry, collating that data and onwardly reporting that to the Commission. And then the last area here is the Commission have an ambition to enhance transparency around methane within the EU and are in the process of creating a transparency database. And that is calling for the development of what they're calling methane intensity values, so they can identify particular areas that are more emissions intense than others, especially when it comes to working with partners around the world to reduce emissions globally, those emissions that are created outside of the territorial boundaries of the EU itself. So hopefully that's a fairly succinct summary of the emissions. I have included in this deck, and hopefully this will be shared with you afterwards, I have included a link to the EU Commission site for the regulation itself. So if you want some bedtime reading, it's quite wordy, it's very in-depth, and as we'll come to understand, there are some challenges with it. It's not the finished article by any means. This will be an evolving and improving regulation as we move forward over time, but it's a stake in the ground. The EU is working alongside partners, for example, the EPA in the United States, who are actually a little bit further ahead when it comes specifically to methane reporting. So it's an evolving landscape, and it's good that industry are keeping appraised and working with their counterparts in government to ensure that we're working together with a common aim of those methane reductions. So who within Europe will have a particular responsibility when it comes to the methane regulations? Well, really, I've split this down into three buckets. You've got the Commission themselves, you've got the member states, and then you've got the commercial organizations operating within those particular member state geographies across the Commission. So the Commission themselves, they are responsible for the coordination of the member states, the reporting on the functioning of the methane regulations itself, and there's a constant feedback loop to the EU from the member states around the progress of implementation. They're looking at monitoring all of the member states' reports that come through, and creation of a transparency database, which will give generalized access to methane emissions from any source across the EU. And then the last one, and they're moving towards this, is imports and global engagement. So putting in the model clauses for importer contracts, creation of that transparency database, a global CH4 monitoring tool, etc. I won't go through the rest of those. But fundamentally, the regulation is set at the Commission level and is mandated to all of the 27 member states. If I move to the right-hand side and look at these two buckets, then the top one is the member states themselves, and that fundamentally is split down into two sections. One is the responsible ministries. So each country, with each member state within the EU, will have a responsible ministry that will have ultimate responsibility for reporting the methane emissions under these regulations back to the Commission. Typically, they are going to be the Ministry of Energy or the Ministry of Environment. And we've spoken to pretty much all of them so far, and they mostly fall into that bucket. There are anomalies like a Department of Net Zero, but that's an agency that sits inside the Environment Ministry. So fundamentally, they're going to fit in those two ministries. Within those, the EU has mandated that each nation state creates what they're calling a competent authority. Now, typically, that's a relatively small team of civil servants working within the responsible ministry that are charged with ensuring compliance, that they will ultimately enforce and impose sanctions. We're not there yet, but ultimately that's the aim. And they will collaborate with the Commission and other competent authorities across the Union. So they are the guys that are, as industry will be speaking to when they are reporting their emissions inventories to their member state, be that Germany or France or wherever. Below that are the individual commercial operators. So they really sit in a couple of areas, ones that are reporting on abandoned or historical assets, and those that also got live or active assets. So even though an asset may be capped and historical and out of use, that does not remove the obligation for reporting on emissions from that particular asset. Active assets are a lot more straightforward. They are ones that are currently in operation and have the propensity to emit methane emissions on a regular and ongoing basis. The last bucket right at the bottom there is importers. So this is MRV equivalency, and this will come in from 2030 to allow compliance with the maximum methane intensity values that the EU Commission are putting into place. So really, that's a sort of a top-level overview of how the structures are in place at the Commission level, at the member state level, and for the responsibilities on industry for for reporting. So hopefully that's given some clarity. So the regulation itself, and this is where I've included, you can see there's a link if you wanted to click on that. If you don't know where the regulation is, you can just follow that link to the EU Lex site and download the regulation itself. It's a very, very wordy document. I've just done a few highlights there for things like the Commissioner looking at the methane being a precursor to ground level ozone, for example, because there's the new regulations coming in around air quality. This will be linked through to that. As the EU is the world's largest importer of fossil fuels, the EU in of itself is an important contributor to global emissions by virtue of the fact it is such a large importer of fossil fuels. It's clearly stating there has to be an accurate MRV solution in place to carry out that reporting to the competent authority within the nation state. But that would also include plans for reduction of those emissions, including LDAR and restrictions on venting and flaring, as I mentioned earlier on. And just to reiterate, we are very aware as an organisation of the fantastic work that the oil and gas industry are undertaking to reduce that venting and flaring in a voluntary basis, and will continue and accelerate that work moving forward. So this is really in line with what the Commission are aiming for as sort of good practice across the industry. The member state, as I mentioned in the previous slide, must appoint at least one competent authority. Now, from what we've seen so far, each member state has implemented one competent authority. No one, as far as we're aware, has implemented multiple competent authorities. I think it's just within the regulations to allow for it, but realistically, there will be a single competent authority within each nation state, and the legislation will allow for mechanisms for inspection, for examination of documentation and records, emission measurements, and potentially site checks. And that will all be coordinated through that competent authority within the nation state. So it is in there already in the legislation that was released in July last year. We're not there yet. The competent authorities, just as some background, there was a deadline for them to be up and operational by April this year. Most have been. There are still some that are finalising their situation, but most of the competent authorities are in existence already. A word of note on here: most of the competent authorities, they're not large teams. They're maybe 6, 8, 12, 10, 12 people. They're not huge teams within these competent authorities. So from our experience, and they are ramping up at the moment. They are very much in ramp-up phase. So be aware when you're engaging with these competent authorities. Just a bit on where the opportunities were seen from the member states on using technology rather than IPCC Tier 2 estimates. The regulation, although it just doesn't explicitly state they must use technology, neither does it say that they can't use technology. And the engagement that we've had across the EU has been widely very positive. The challenge, as always in public sector, is funding it. So there are many different areas that they are looking at to include the use of technology to verify reported emissions. And as many of you on this call will already be using a technology to assist you in the collation of your reporting data, that should come as no surprise. And they will, as time evolves, they will be looking at utilizing more and more technology, not just satellite and aerial, but other technologies as well, to ensure that the supplementing of estimated data will continue. The tracking from source to EU distribution is something that, obviously, as a satellite provider, we're able to support the EU in. So as they move towards monitoring imports of fossil fuels from outside the EU, they're looking at technology to help them in that endeavor. The challenge with estimates is it's very difficult to determine exactly where, when, and how much. It really is an estimate. It's a guess, a best guess. So technology is there, satellite and aerial and others, is there to help these competent authorities in determining exactly what those emissions were. We're quite fortunate in Europe that we don't really have what we would determine as super emitters. There are significant emissions coming from within the EU, but when we look outside of the EU, there are super emitters. So this is what they're trying to build in to the regulations. The competent authority, I won't dwell on that. They've already we've already mentioned that, but we are working directly with those competent authorities, as we are the Commission, as we are with industry. We are a third party, a trusted third party in this process. I should also mention at this point, we at GHGSat have a policy of we don't name and shame. We will not pass on a company name to a government body. In actual fact, there are processes and mechanisms in place for our oil and gas customers that ensure that that would never happen contractually. But we have a policy of not naming and shaming. It's in no one's interest to do that. We would work just purely from a verification process with the Commission, as we would with any other government body around the world for emissions that take place within their jurisdiction. We're also able to help to give them this accuracy and efficiency. I mentioned earlier that they are relatively small teams in size. They're relatively modest in size. So over time, they will become more reliant on technology to support them in their commitments back to the Commission for reporting. So it's helping industry, it's helping government by utilizing accurate satellite and aerial data in their ambitions for compliance with these regulations. I'm not going to go through this in too much timeline. I'm also going to share a link to this. This is on the EU's Commission site. But this is about a timeline of responsibilities for commercial operators for reporting to their competent authorities. So it's talking about the source level methane emissions from all of the sources. It's talking about how from different areas across industry, where those emissions are coming from, the recurrence of the reporting. So some of that recurrence is never, it's a one-off snapshot. Other ones, it's on an annual basis. Others, it's on a quarterly basis. So I will also share the link to this if folk are not aware of the obligations on industry for reporting schedules. Now, you should have this information from your respective competent authority, but I'll share it in case you don't. A little bit about our relationship with the EU. We've got a very strong collaboration with the EU Commission, but also the European Space Agency. So we are a key collaboration partner with the European Space Agency, and we've participated in many ESA programs since our inception nearly a decade ago. We are headquartered in Canada, and as part of that, the Canadian government is a full and active participant in ESA programs such as Horizon and what are called TPMs, or third-party missions. Plus, we have bilateral partnerships with not only the Commission, but also individual member states. So because we are headquartered in Canada does not limit us in our ability to operate effectively within the bounds of the EU. And we are engaging with many of the national space agencies across the Commission on individual projects that may or may not relate to the EU methane regulations. Some of them do, some of them don't. But we are engaging across the spectrum in Europe at a government level, as well as our commercial industry customers, both in oil and gas and in waste management. I'm just going to talk a little bit, and I'm conscious of time, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the challenges and opportunities, the challenges faced by government, but also the opportunities for government and industry. So I know this, again, is a bit of an eye chart, but really I sort of highlighted 6 potential challenges facing government. You know, accurate emissions inventories. Ultimately, the goal of the regulation is to get as much accurate information as possible. So removing as much as possible the reliance just on estimates, as good as they are, and supplementing that with as much real data as possible. Supporting those data-driven reduction programs that governments are implementing, both at a national level and at a Commission level across Europe. And being able to support that reduction program by knowing where they are now, where they are through the journey, and clarifying where their endpoint is when they get to. Strengthening that regulatory enforcement. So if there is an enforcement side to the regulation, being able to, with clarity, ensure that the information that the government has access to is correct and isn't just an estimate in that regard. Identifying and targeting super emitters. Now, we're fortunate in Europe, we don't have that many super emitters, or what we would classify as a super emitter, but that's not to say that they wouldn't happen at some point in the future. So we are able to help both industry and government when it comes to ensuring those issues don't come into effect. I'll give you an example of a super emission event that took place. We were able to successfully identify the leaks in Nord Stream almost immediately after those leaks took place, by identifying what we would classify as a super emission from the leaks that took place in the Nord Stream pipeline. We've also seen them in other territories across Europe, where unfortunate, HP network leaks from the mains gas network have happened, and we've been able to spot those and inform the operator, if it was commercially operated, or the public sector body, if they were public sector owned, to highlight to them that this leak was taking place. Monitoring remote and inaccessible areas, that's a real key one, because it's very expensive to put people on the ground. As a commercial operator, you will know that it's very labor intensive to trek to remote areas to reduce a particular leak or an event. Being able to track that emission remotely is hugely beneficial, both to government and to those commercial operators. And ultimately, it's about helping everyone meet their climate commitments, and doing that with trust. That's the key element here, is that industry trusts government and government trusts industry, because it's built on real data is the aim. Now, if I flip that on its head, what are the potential opportunities, both for the nations, but also for industry? So enhancing regulatory compliance. It's key for competent authorities within the nation states and the operators to be in regulatory compliance, because that means that both sides are doing the right thing. Achieving those climate goals. Every commercial operator we've ever spoken to has their own climate goals, the amount that they want to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by, and by what time. So able to track that. And the same for nation state governments. They will set a goal to be, to reduce their emissions by a certain amount by a certain date. How are they tracking to get there? And using real data is allowing them to do that. Improving the transparency and accountability. It's ensuring that it's building on that trust model that I mentioned on the previous slide. From a government side, optimizing those public resources, but that will be just as true for industry, for very expensive human resources in commercial and industry operators. So maximizing the amount of return for any activity that's going on, both commercially and environmentally within those operations. Supporting R&D. I mentioned earlier that we do a lot of work with national space agencies, but also ESA. A lot of that work is R&D. So it's developing technologies that allow government and industry to benefit from newer technology in the understanding of methane emissions and ways to counter those emissions to ultimately be in compliance with the legislation which is coming into effect now. And then the last one is to drive international collaboration. I mentioned right at the beginning, there's a whole bunch of voluntary and compulsory regulations around the world. We're becoming much more, especially with global participation events such as COP, where nations and industry are coming together to formulate methodologies that would allow data to be shared for global benefit across industry and across government. And the data from our side, we're a neutral party in this. We will share that data. We'll work with government and we'll work with industry to ensure that we're supporting that international collaboration, because we see that as being in everybody's interest. So what is our solution? Well, we have a constellation of satellites, but we also have aircraft where we fit our same sensors to the belly of the aircraft. Ultimately, there's a distinction in its use based upon how accurate resolution you would like that emission observation to take place. So typically, a customer, be they government or be they industry, would start by using satellites. Now, we measure at 100 kilos per hour or above. They are rated at 100 kilos per hour, which is 10 times lower than the public access satellites such as Tropomi. Those public ones are free to access, but the resolution is significantly lower than what we're able to deliver with our satellites. If you need to go lower than that, so you've got a particular methane issue at a coal mine or at an onshore gas facility, we will take our aircraft over those sites, and that resolution, it says on screen 10 kilos per hour. We're seeing potentially significantly lower than that, as low as 2 to 3 kilos per hour with a 1 meter resolution on the aircraft fly pass. So that's typically the run through that a customer, public or private sector, would take, is they would start with satellite, and if they need to go in more depth, they would use aircraft. What is our constellation? So we've got the largest high resolution methane constellation in the world. We've currently got 12 satellites. We started in 2016 with our satellite called Claire. We're now up to 12, and within a couple of months there'll be 2 more satellites going up, 13 and 14, into orbit. The aim is to have a much larger constellation, because what that does, it has a massively positive impact on revisit time. So if you can imagine those satellites spinning around the world in an ellipse to cover every territory in the world, it takes typically between 1 to 2 days to revisit the same site. And the idea is we want to bring that down to a matter of hours. Excuse me. And the only way we're going to do that is by increasing, excuse me, frog in my throat. Excuse me, I'm just going to take some water. the only way we're going to do that is by increasing the number of satellites. Now, as you can imagine, that's a very capital-intensive operation to put satellites in orbit. We work with a commercial launch partner, and we work with a number of key hardware partners to help us get our satellites into orbit in the right position within the constellation. And typically those will come online within a month or so of being up in orbit, and as soon as they're in operation, they're dramatically increasing the capability that we've got to monitor those emissions. Europe is a key area for us globally to ensure we are focusing on within our constellation. Just to dive into that a little bit further, I mentioned we've got a 1 to 2 revisit time. The threshold is 100 kilos per hour. So typically that would be a typical gas facility. It might be a compressor station. It might be from a high pressure network. It might be at an LNG facility, at a port. Typically they're going to be, in an order of above 100 kilos per hour. That's why we determined that was an optimal amount. We are going to reduce that as the technology improves over time. The image size is typically 12 kilometers by 12 kilometers, and the spatial resolution, i.e. each individual pixel, is 25 meters squared. So we've got very, very good resolution, as I say, 10 times clearer than it would be from publicly accessible satellite operators around the world. So that's giving a very, very deep insight into those facilities, and by virtue of gaining that data will allow that compliance, and I bring this back to the regulation, into compliance with the regulation, or understanding your position before reporting. The other side of our capability is our what we call data.air. That's our aircraft base. And you can see there that the resolution goes down to less than a meter. We are typically flying those aircraft at about 3,000 meters. So for imperial measurements, it's around 10,000 feet. They do need a clear day to do this, but the results are quite profound when we're seeing that data. And you can see that individual plume coming from a facility, and the deeper the color red, the higher the intensity of that emission. They are both satellite and aircraft is CH4 only, it's methane only. However, as you would have seen in that previous graphic, we are in an R&D situation at the moment with CO2 as well. And the ambition is that we will ultimately have the world's largest methane and CO2 constellations in the world. I mentioned this in passing. We do work with those third-party public satellite operators such as Tropomi. So if you are already utilizing that data, we can bring that in and overlay that in the same view as you would see from the data that's being ingested from our own satellite and aerial platforms. How are you viewing that? Well, there's a number of ways. Our platform is called Spectra. So you'd be able to see visually the point source emissions from wherever you've instructed us to monitor the potential for methane to be emitted. I should note on this point, a null emission or no emissions is oftentimes as important as seeing an emission. To verify that you potentially have done some remedial work in a mine or a gas facility, and checking that remedial action is actually working. So those null events are as important in many cases as emission events. So you're able to visualize that in our portal. If you would rather use that data within your own platforms, then we have an API that you can ingest the data directly into your existing analytical systems. We also have a huge catalog of historical data. So you can plumb that historical data in as well to see trend analysis over a period of time for a particular site or sites. So that's the way that you would access that data. We constantly independently verify. So we work with predominantly academic third parties. So the likes of Stanford University and others, where they would run blind trials for us to test. This is an example of one that was done in France, where we are very, very close within margins of error to where the actual emission result was, or the emissions that were emitted through the blind test were done. So we're in a very, very tight margin of error. So you can be confident that the data you're reporting to the legislation, I always bring this back to the legislation, that the data you're presenting is accurate, or as accurate as it can be. And I'm going to finish off, and then I'm happy to take any questions. We're collaborating with the likes of Harvard and Stanford and other pan-national space agencies, so NASA and ESA and other organizations such as the Canadian Space Agency, the UN Environment Programme, and others. From our commercial customers and our public sector customers, we have a whole range. This is just an example because I wanted to give you an indication of the scope of the types of customers that we're working with. So that's waste management, it's public sector, but importantly for this audience, it's those in the oil and gas and some very familiar names that you'll see within that list. So hopefully that's brought us in roughly on time. And I'm very happy to answer any questions that anybody might have.
Thank you very much, Pete. It was first nice overview of regulation, and it's never enough of these overviews because you always can read from different sides, but it's good to have an overview. And thank you very much for really elaborating what actually satellites can do. We got quite a few questions in the chat. So, but maybe it would be good to start with the one with the topic with which you end actually, and this is with all these thresholds and how it's measured, because maybe Professor Stern would like to elaborate more, but he put the question how is actually possible that at one of your first slides it was so low share of agricultural emissions, otherwise is usually vice versa. So agriculture.
Yeah, and I can absolutely answer that question. When it comes to agriculture is really hard to measure from satellite because the majority of them are diffuse emissions. We can detect emissions coming from biomass stores, for example, whether it might be silage or animal waste stores. So we can do that, but it's much harder to measure those diffuse emissions. So if you've got a 10,000 hectare field full of cattle, picking up those individual methane emissions from agriculture is very hard to do. Now there are technologies that are better than satellite. They're ground-based monitors that are able to detect that with more accuracy, but there aren't any satellites in the world that can do that we know of in those diffuse emissions. Point source emissions is where satellite and aerial is much better. Now, having said that, we are in our research and development phase to try and increase the amount of accuracy that we've got, because what we try and do is operate at a very high level of accuracy. And as soon as you start diffusing that emission, we're reducing the level of accuracy. And when it goes below a certain threshold, to us, it's not acceptable, so we won't sell it. So if we've got a customer that's got a large agri business and they want us to measure those, perhaps we're not the right organization for them at this moment, because satellite technology is not necessarily at the point it needs to be able to pick up those large spread diffuse emissions in the way that would meet our acceptability thresholds. So that 3%, it is those others. So it is, bio stores in predominantly agriculture. We are also working more and more with wastewater, which has got a lot of agri waste potential in there. But predominantly it's point source emissions.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. It seems clear now. We have a few more questions asking for clarification. So one is actually, which was factor used for your conversion between methane and CO2 at one of the slides?
Yeah, so we use a standard IPCC methodology, conversion tables. I'm not a scientist, so I would not feel it would be appropriate for me to delve into that in too much detail. We're using industry standard conversions for methane to CO2 equivalent. I do have a very good technical document that I can share. So along with the deck, I'm very happy to share that. And what it's not just limited to the methodology for our conversion rates. It actually details exactly how we gather those emissions and report on them. What are the algorithms that we're using to analyze the raw data that's coming in to us, of which there's terabytes of data, and how are we analyzing that data? What methodologies are we using, and how is that detailed in its outputs? So I'm very happy to share. We've got a very, very comprehensive white paper that we can share with the community to inform everybody if they're interested in reading that in more detail. I don't want to give anybody any inaccurate information at the moment.
I mean, thank you for that. That would be really great, because then we can upload it together with the slides, or we can.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and any other documentation that I think might be helpful, I'm very happy to share that with the community.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. There is also one additional question for actually converting the units, and this is how to come from ppm to kilograms per hour. So do you
Yeah, we have an algorithm to do that conversion. Our satellites measure in kilos per hour, and we report in the satellites measure in parts per billion, and we convert that to kilograms per hour using the methodology that is in that technical document, the technical white paper that I will share with everybody. There is a mathematical formula laid out in there that details exactly how we're doing that conversion. I've seen it. I don't profess to understand it, but I will happily share that white paper with the community so you can understand exactly how we're doing those conversions. But we will always measure that in parts per billion and present that in kilos per hour. So because our satellites, or rather our sensors, are rated at kilos per hour. So the satellite is rated at 100 kilos per hour, and the same sensor on an aircraft, because it's so much closer to the Earth, is rated at between 5 and 10 kilos per hour. Just an anecdote on that, we are seeing emissions significantly lower than the rating of the sensor when it's on an aircraft. There was a historical landfill site underneath a golf course. So the landfill site had been closed for a number of years. It was now a golf course, and we detected 2 to 3 kilos per hour of emissions coming from the golf course. The historical operator of that were then able to determine that the skin over the top of the landfill had failed, the membrane, and were able to remediate that very quickly to eliminate those emissions. So the actual, the parts per billion and the kilos per hour, parts per billion is quantity, kilos per hour is duration. So how much in duration are we seeing over a period of time? So that's the reason we report that, because for somebody like an oil and gas operator or a landfill operator, they want to see the intensity over time of those plumes. That's the way that we rate it like that. But again, it's all explained in that technical white paper, so we're very happy to share that with the community and be on hand if anybody has any follow-up questions from today. And obviously, I've got my colleagues in the oil and gas team who again would be very happy to help with any questions that might arise.
Thank you for that. We will really upload and make this access to everyone. There was a question asking, will there be further studies to detect the emissions of other gases, of these short-lived climate forces gases, other than methane? So, I mean, either in your company or if you know in general.
Yeah, so other organizations, both public and commercial, are monitoring other emissions. So predominantly, the vast majority of monitoring is happening with CO2 and methane. There are others for sulfur dioxide and nitrous dioxide and others. We're not. We are predominantly measuring methane, and that's what we will continue to do. But we are, as I mentioned earlier, we've got an R&D project at the moment with some test satellites for monitoring CO2. So we can do both at the same time. That's the ambition. We're not there yet. The CO2 portion of it is still in R&D phase. But predominantly it's methane. You know, we are the methane experts. That's what we do. There are others that will monitor those others, especially with their impact, their direct impact on air quality. So nitrous and sulfur as a direct cause of air quality, and especially in the EU, when the air quality, the NEC regulations come in a few years, that will have a big impact. Methane is an indirect contributor to ground level ozone, which is considered an air quality issue. So, you know, yes, we can from a methane perspective, but we're not going to be doing anything else other than methane and CO2.
So thank you for clarification. And then coming back actually from satellites and all this measurement to the regulation as such. And Mr. Martinez put in the chat remark that actually your slide 14 could have been complemented adding the verifiers. And I agree with him because actually, yes, this is the important part of regulation and important stakeholders in the entire process.
Yep. Yeah, I could certainly add that. We out of all the 27, I think we've been in contact and we've got a relationship with 24 of them. It's 3 that we've still yet to engage with. I can certainly share what I can when it comes to bearing in mind GDPR regulations and personal details. I can share certainly the ministries that they're residing in. And I will need to take that away because I don't want to send out any personal information that will be in contravention of any regulations. But I'm sure that, you know, they will be more than happy to engage with anybody that's on this call. So let me verify that, and I will share as much as I can as quickly as I can. But yes, you're right. That's an omission on my part, and maybe I should have added those individual competent authorities to that table. So yeah, very well spotted.
Yeah, thank you for that. So we are almost at the end of the time. We started kind of a few minutes later. So please raise your hand if you still have questions. So let's see. So it seems this is not the case. So with that, Pete, thank you very much.
Pleasure.
The overview of many things which are connected. We are going to publish the slides. We are going to publish these additional materials and also recording if it's fine with you.
Absolutely.
And then I will just invite everybody to pay attention because the next session is really planned and agreed for 14th of July. And with that, good afternoon and good evening to everyone, and see you in a month's time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.